Well, good morning and welcome to your next Menopause Morning. My apologies. I typically do this on Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and I was traveling locally to do some education yesterday, so that time frame was not going to work. So here we are today. And what I want to talk about today is something that, on a level should be very exciting for you. And when I'm talking about that, sorry, one second, adjust my microphone. So when I'm talking about that, what I want you to recognize, and I think this is exciting for all women, is that uh, the government or legislation is starting to recognize menopause. And it's about time, right? Whereas many states are starting to look at legislation to help women with menopause. It's even recognized that if you happen to be a woman who's using bioidentical hormones, that is typically not covered by insurance because, again, there's just a lack of recognition from legislation. So I think that's really great news. And there's been a lot of celebrities lately who are really pushing for legislation. And I think it's very important for menopause to get the recognition that it deserves. And now, this doesn't always mean that it's going to be the answer that you're looking for, though. Because obviously it's important for menopause to get recognition. Yet, what when we think about this from a perspective is that what's going to be really at the forefront for you as a woman with menopause is bioidentical hormones, which is typically the use of estradiol, either creams or patches, or perhaps even pellets. Very often, along with that, a oral forms of progesterone and even sometimes testosterone as well. And I've seen testosterone be given to women either in their creams or sometimes in pellets or also utilizing shots. And the the thing with this, while I'm so happy of the recognition for you as a woman with menopause, it's still they're still not going to address the core of the issue for you. And something I want you to be very aware of is that about 2 million women every year in the US enter perimenopause. So you go from childbearing years into perimenopause, into menopause, and then postmenopausal. And for about 10 to 20% of those women, they don't have any symptoms. Well, short of the two true symptoms of menopause. I'm sure you've heard me mention this before, which are when you go from childbearing years into perimenopause and menopause, you will stop having a monthly cycle and you will no longer be able to conceive. And what I can share is that probably most women that I've seen over the years, because I've been working with women with menopause for over 21 and a half years now at this point, and most are pretty excited to stop having a monthly cycle and not being able to conceive anymore. And yet that's about 10 to 20%. So that means the other 80 to 90% are suffering with some type of symptoms. And this could be you. Now, sometimes the symptoms are mild, sometimes they're moderate, and sometimes the symptoms are very aggressive. And you're familiar with the symptoms, whether it be weight gain, mood swings, hot flashes, sleeplessness, fatigue, brain fog, really, and vaginal dryness. I mean, just the list goes on with this. And what I want you to really understand is that the way your body as a female, the way your body has been created, so whether you believe in God or something else, I tend to believe that our bodies were created and then we've evolved over time. Now, what I want you to understand that as a woman, you want to look at it from a perspective. Let me make this a little bit larger for us. Okay. I want you to look at this from a perspective of how your body is designed to work. Yeah, so when when you have a stress response, the first response to any kind of stressor, whether it be a mental, emotional stressor or a physical stressor tied into anything driving inflammation in your body, the first response is always in your brain. And then your brain sends a message to your hypothalamus, which then decodes that message, sends another message to your pituitary, and then finally the pituitary creates a messenger and sends it to the adrenal glands. And your system is really how the brain, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the adrenal glands work collectively together. So it's not only about estrogens or progesterone or only about testosterone. And what I want you to really understand with this is that the way your body is designed, in childbearing years, you're producing about 2/3 of your estrogens in your ovaries. Now, once you're transitioning from childbearing years into perimenopause, now you've got a drop of the production in your ovaries. But then what's happening is mostly your adrenal glands are picking up this slack. So you can still produce the estrogens, you can still produce the progesterone in the adrenal glands, and for the whole of your life, even in childbearing years, you're dependent on your adrenal glands primarily to produce testosterone. All right. So the problem with this, or let me say the good thing first, is if this system is working properly, so that HPA axis and how your brain interacts with that, if that system is working properly, you are able to maintain perfect hormone production even going through perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopausal. Now, obviously, when you're not having a monthly cycle and you can't conceive, you don't need the same production of estrogen and progesterone. So your body needs less, and your adrenal glands are more than able, if they're in vitality, to produce and maintain your perfect hormonal balance. So this is the 10 to 20% of the women that the only symptoms they're feeling is they're basically, don't have a monthly cycle and can't conceive anymore, and that's it. So the problem comes in though is that when we get back to, let me pull this up once more here really quickly. So when we get back to the fact that it's really about how your brain, your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenals all work collectively together. Well, if that isn't working properly for you, well, then guess what? Now you have a deficiency in that HPA axis. So now you don't have that same ability to produce the estrogens and the progesterone and the testosterone that you really need. Yeah, and then what happens is you go to the doctor, and they typically only will test, and they'll use blood testing for this, but they'll test for testosterone, estradiol specifically, and for progesterone. And then the common wisdom is that, oh, well, if you're low in estradiol, we need to give you estradiol. And if you're low in testosterone, we need to give you testosterone. If you're low in progesterone, we need to give you progesterone, right? But the whole thing though in here is that the only reason these are low is because your HP axis has lost vitality. And it's quite common for women, unfortunately, and you could recognize this by the 80 to 90% that are dealing with this, and that could be you right now, is it's much more difficult for women than it is for men. I might be one of the only men that you'll ever hear say this. A woman's life is way more difficult than a man's, and I know this from working with women for more than 21 and a half years, is that, most women spend 30 years prior to the transition into menopause really overworked, overwhelmed, and overstressed. Think about it. The typical life of a woman: you take care of your children, you take care of your spouse or your significant other, you take care of your home. Very often you're involved in your church or community. Oh, and on top of that, you work a full-time job. So by the time you enter perimenopause, this HP axis has lost vitality. So what should be picking up slack of hormone production once your ovaries are no longer able to do their same job just isn't working well. So and it kind of spins you out of control. Now from that perspective, then I want you to look at it, from a different perspective. So let me pull up another slide here for you. And this is kind of hormone basics. And this is what I want you to really understand, is that when you're talking about this system, which I'm talking about, which is your HPA axis, it's really what's in the yellow circle is really the foundation of what's going on hormonally for you, or not if you don't have the vitality here. And it's really tied into what produces your first baseline hormone. So once you have gone through this transition from childbearing years into perimenopause, menopause, and then postmenopausal, now you're dependent on this HPA axis for hormone balance. And it really starts with the first hormone in this system is called pregnenolone. And you can think of pregnenolone as a mother hormone, because every other hormone at this point in your life is going to be a conversion from pregnenolone. There could be also some production of estrogens in your fat cells, and that's typically more estrone that's produced in your fat cells. But what's going on here though is that the pregnenolone converts into DHEA, which then converts into andros, testosterone, and estrogens. So it's all about the conversion, but you can't convert from a place of depletion. So if your foundation of your hormonal system isn't working well, then the end result of your hormonal system isn't working well either. So that's one pathway. And the other pathway goes from pregnenolone into progesterone and cortisol, recognizing that cortisone is your natural anti-inflammatory and cortisol is your primary stress response hormone. So this is the dynamic that's all going on. And the challenge that I see with the typical HRT treatments is that you're not addressing what's in the circle. And then the problem is you're never really fixing the system. And it's the system that's creating the problems. It's not just the lack of estrogens or testosterone or progesterone. And and then what's also important with this, I'm going to go much deeper into this next week. I'm going to talk about the three estrogens specifically and how they tie into different aspects of your health and your life postmenopausally. But what I want you to understand on a level really what's going on here. And this is an example of a test that I do with the clients in my practice, where we're looking at a 24-hour urine collection, and we're looking at not just estradiol, but we're looking at estrone, estradiol, and estriol. We're looking at the ratios of those, and then we're also looking at how your liver affects this. Because this is something that a lot of women aren't ever really shown, or this isn't discussed with you. And the thing that I want you to recognize too is that you've got three estrogens. You've got what's called E1, E2, and E3. So that's your estrone, your estradiol, and your estriol. Now, a proper ratio of these, and this is recognized by the graph that is both purple and green. So the graphs on the bottom are where you should be, and the graphs on the top are an example of a recognition of where somebody else is, right? So you ultimately want, if you added up your E1 and E2, which is your estrone and your estradiol, the sum of those, if you add those two together, it should be equal to or less than the total of your E3, which is your estriol. So you should, with this graph, you should equal purple to green or more green than purple. And you can recognize with this example, this is a person who their estrone and their estradiol is actually higher as a sum. And really it's about 30% of this ratio is the estriol, when it should be at least 50%. So this, when the ratios are off, that is a risk factor for breast cancer. So obviously you want your estrogen ratios to be proper. Now, the next one over to the right, where it talks about the estrogen hydroxylation. Now, what's interesting with this is not about the estrogen specifically. This is about what your liver does with the estrogen. So when we think of your phase one liver detoxification pathway, in this liver detoxification process, your liver attaches an enzyme to the active estrogens. And this is an enzyme called cytochrome P450, which is arguably the most important enzyme for your liver function. Now, if this phase one of your liver is working properly, you're going to have more of what's called the 2-OH pathway. So this is really helping to produce what is recognized as the safest and the weakest estrogenic metabolite. So that's recognized by the green color coding in that middle. And then now if there are problems with the phase one liver, now it could actually create more of instead of a 2-OH pathway, more of a 4-OH pathway. Well, with this is a more potent metabolite, and it can generate like free radicals, and it could potentially be damaging to your DNA and promoting really abnormal tissue growth. So and a very common challenge with this is women who have too high of the 4-OH pathway can easily also be this can be affecting your bone health and your skeletal health overall. Outside of the fact of again potentially damaging to DNA and really also encouraging abnormal tissue growth based on the estrogen metabolite. And then if there's even deeper issues with your phase one liver detoxification pathway, then it creates something called the 16-OH pathway. And this is recognized by the red in here. And that's it's really a highly estrogenic, and it's associated with active tissue proliferation, which is a better, a kind of a more technical way of saying a significant risk factor for breast cancer. So what you can recognize is there's, even with a very healthy liver, you have the 2-OH, the 4-OH, and a 16-OH going on all the time, but there's a certain level of balance. You want the you want that 16-OH to be, which is the red. You really want that, or I'm sorry, the 16-OH, which is the yellow. You want that to be at 20%. The 4-OH, which can be potentially damaging to the DNA and promoting abnormal tissue growth, which is then risk factor for breast cancer, you want that at 7% or less. And sorry, I inverted those earlier when I was talking about those. But the 4-OH is really the highest cancer causing of these. The 2-OH is the one that's really affecting your bone and skeletal health. And the green is where you want to be the highest amount. You want this to be about 73%. But you can see, as the result that we're looking here of this particular client, the 4-OH, which is the most dangerous of these, which is going to be tied into, again, the damaging the DNA and promoting abnormal tissue growth and being a risk factor for breast cancer. This person's at 11%. That's too high, right? And the 11%, which is tied into the bone and skeletal health, is only 11%. And if you're too low from 20% or too high from 20%, that's a risk factor for your bone and skeletal health. So I really want you to see how all of this kind of works together, and also how it's all tied into the whole system. So the problems at times is that if you're only like, number one, to recognize, remember, you have three estrogens. You're typically only having one estrogen measured, which is your estradiol. And then that's typically what you're put on. Yet, as we're going to get into deeper next week, you're gonna understand that the most important of your estrogens postmenopausally is going to be your estrone, and the one you always want the highest is the estriol. Yeah, so we're going to go much deeper into this next week, so you understand it at a different level. So while I'm so happy for yourself as a woman that our government and legislation is starting to really recognize menopause as an issue, and what I also want you to understand, it doesn't mean that what's going to be recommended to you is really fixing your problem. And I want to even go a little bit deeper. When I was talking about that HPA axis, I want you to recognize that your hormonal system is a reactive system. So what that means is, the problem isn't your hormonal system. The problem is whatever's causing that reaction in your body. And primary causes that I see with women in my practice are infections in their gut, infections elsewhere in the body, food sensitivities driving an inflammatory response, toxicity driving an inflammatory response, really poor diet or poor fundamentals of health, a significant amount of mental, emotional stress, like all these things that are driving inflammation. They basically put you in a position of losing vitality in your hormonal system. And then you just can't keep the balance that your body has already been created and has designed to maintain. So I wanted to really address this for you. Again, excited for legislation starting to pay attention to menopause, but I also want you to recognize that there's a way of really fixing the system, and there's a way of going after symptoms, and they are two different methods. And I'm not, if you choose to go down an HRT path, that's your choice, and you could have some symptom relief. But even if you're going down the HRT path, I still say you still want to fix the system. Yeah, so recognizing you do have that option. And I want to bring up one other thing before a couple other things before I finish up today. So number one is, I do send out emails to the Menopause Morning list, typically the night before I do these, and with the subject line that I'm going to be discussing, the link of where to go and the time and such. So to become a part of that, you can look at the link below this video, and there will be a link where you can sign up for the Menopause Morning notifications. And when you sign up for the Menopause Morning notifications, you're going to get a free copy of the ebook of Fat, Fatigued, and Frustrated, which is an action step guide for all of your fundamentals, which is something you really need to address when you're taking on the pathway of really working on your hormones. So it's something that's at kind of a core foundational level for every woman. And in that way you get the notifications, because I'll let you know what I'm going to be talking about, and that way you can, create the urgency of watching based on the subjects that are really important for you. And then the last thing I want to bring up, starting next Tuesday, I've always been doing the Menopause Morning at 9 a.m. on Tuesdays. I'm going to switch that to 8 a.m. This way it's morning for everybody, whether you're in the Pacific or the Mountain Time or Central Time or Eastern Time. And I feel that will be a lot easier for every woman to attend. And I do typically do these live, and I do them live so you can ask questions or make comments live throughout this. And if you don't watch it live and you're watching the recording, please, by all means, put your comment or your question below, and I will answer that personally for you. And with that said, have a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.